We're going to talk again about the Talmud because a fellow who commented on my first Talmud video, his name is mr.cantstoptherobot, he commented and left a link for me that was a conversation between Jan, Irving, and Jessie Spots. And the first part of their video I'm not going to talk about. They were discussing some prominent social media figures and that kind of stuff. But then they got into an interesting conversation about the Babylonian Talmud and the veracity of various quotes circulating online that are put forward as items to be ridiculed or critiqued within modern Judaism and within the Talmud itself. And so Mr. Irving said that he is going to put out some kind of video debunking a bunch of these quotes that get circulated about the Talmud. And it's kind of like defending the Talmud from these accusations. And, you know, it's really a good thing for anybody to do rather than to listen to somebody do it, is to go do it yourself. That if you have the time, that would be the best thing. And I did that myself in the past. So what I'm going to do is show you one of the passages that he uses in his talk that I think that he gets completely wrong. And I'm not sure how he got it wrong. I don't know what sources he was using or any of that, because he didn't say in the video, but you know, I'm sure if we asked him personally, he would be able to provide all that kind of information. But so not knowing, presumably I would be able to come up with the same thing, right? Like, this is called replication in science. Somebody does a test, they come up with a result, you go and you do not necessarily the same test they did, but you test the hypothesis in perhaps even a different way, and that might be better even than doing it exactly the way they did it. So the one we're going to take is probably the most controversial one, and it has to do, well, one of the 2 or 3 most controversial ones, and it has to do with Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, and what he's up to according to the Talmud. So we're going to look at Tractate Gittin and its folio 57a. I don't know what translations or what edition that Jan Irving was using, but we're going to start out with the same one that I used in the previous video, which is the steinsaltz-koren-davidson edition of the Talmud, which you can look at for free on sefaria.org, and I'll put the link in the description. If you go to this website, what you'll see is some Hebrew, and then you'll see some English, and then some Hebrew and some English, and it goes back and forth. This is already a translation because, as you may or may not know, most of the Babylonian Talmud was written in Aramaic and not Hebrew. So the people who have translated this, which is Addenda, Steinsaltz, and other people, to create this edition, they've had to translate the Aramaic into Hebrew, and then they've also translated the Aramaic into English. So Gittin 57a. It's about the necromantic rituals and corpse or dead spirit interrogation that's being conducted by a guy named Onkelos. And Onkelos is a Greek version of some Latin name. Onkelos is deciding whether he wants to convert from Roman or Greek polytheism to Judaism. So he's going to summon some dead spirits and ask them if Judaism is worth his time or not. And if you're going to be raising up some dead spirits, presumably you want to do some important dead spirits and not just some random guy. So the first one that he picks is a guy named Balaam from the Old Testament. So we'll pick this up here. You'll notice if you're looking at this translation in English that there's bold text and not bold text. I am fairly certain that what this means is that the bold text is literally the translation from the Talmud, like that's the only text there, and the text that's not in bold, the normal text, is what the translators have filled in so that you can understand what you're reading. And so this is kind of an interesting approach. It's a good approach, I should say, not interesting, it's a good approach, because it gives you some confidence about what came directly from the original text and then what the translators have added to help you understand. Onkelos went and raised Balaam from the grave through necromancy. He said to him, "Who is most important in the world where you are now?" Which is the underworld, right? Balaam said to him, "The Jewish people." Onkelos asked him, "Should I then attach myself to them here in this world?" Balaam said to him, "You shall not seek their peace or their welfare all the days." And then there's a citation here for Deuteronomy 27:3. Now, Jan Irving was making a very big deal about these biblical citations that are in the Talmud, and saying that, oh, well, then this means you got to go look at Deuteronomy 23:7 to figure out the context. I'm not 100% certain, but I wouldn't get too carried away with that. I think this is probably something that the translator from Aramaic to Hebrew and from Aramaic to English has added so that you will get the citation, or it's something that a rabbinic authority's added. I'm pretty sure that that's not in the original text, because these guys would have known all of the Torah and a lot of this Talmudic stuff front and back. They would have known it. So what they're doing is making mental notes about certain phrases of text that are being repeated, not necessarily a citation to say, go look here for the context. Onkelos said to him, "What is the punishment of that man?" A euphemism for Balaam himself. So what is the punishment of that man, which is a euphemism for Balaam himself, in the next world? Balaam said to him, "He is cooked in boiling semen, as he caused Israel to engage in licentious behavior with the daughters of Moab." So that's the first person. The first person that Onkelos interrogated was a guy named Balaam. Now next we're going to get the second person that he interrogated. Onkelos went and raised Jesus the Nazarene from the grave through necromancy. Onkelos said to him, "Who is the most important in that world where you are now?" Jesus said to him, same thing that Balaam said, "The Jewish people." Onkelos asked him, "Should I then attach myself to them in this world?" Jesus said to him, "Their welfare you shall seek, their misfortune you shall not seek, for anyone who touches them is regarded as if he were touching the apple of his eye." So you should help out the Jews, you should not hurt the Jews, and to touch the Jews or to harm them is to hurt your own self, sticking your own finger in your eye, that's what it's saying. Which is interesting because the finger in the eye metaphor is used in other places in the Talmud in a very disturbing fashion, if you know what I'm talking about. Onkelos said to him, "What is the punishment of that man?" A euphemism for Jesus himself. Okay, so this is the same thing he did to Balaam. He asked him, what's the punishment that you're receiving? Jesus said to him, "He is punished with boiling excrement. As the Master said, anyone who mocks the words of the sages will be sentenced to boiling excrement." And this was his sin as he mocked the words of the sages. The Gemara comments, "Come and see the difference between the sinners of Israel and the prophets of the nations of the world. As Balaam, who was a prophet, wished Israel harm, whereas Jesus the Nazarene, who was a Jewish sinner, sought their well-being." So Jan Irving misunderstood two things. The first thing that he misunderstood was that he thought that Jesus and Balaam are the same person, and they're not. They're two different people. He thought that Balaam is supposed to be a code word for Jesus, and that's not actually right. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave the steinsaltz-Davidson Talmud, and we're going to move over to the Soncino edition, and we're going to pick this up, this idea that we're working on, and finish it off over there. This is the newest major edition of the Talmud that's out there, and it says that yes, Jesus of Nazareth, which we would assume would be Jesus Christ, is mentioned here, and he is, according to the Talmud, boiling away in excrement in the underworld for having had the temerity to mock the words of the sages. So that's a closed issue. It's over. It's finished. There's no room for disagreement here. Now we're in the Soncino edition, which is the major one from the earlier part of the 20th century that everybody would have used. For like 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, the Soncino edition would be the major one you would use. That one scholar who's written like the 2,000 books or whatever, he's got an edition out too, but it's not widely available, so you're probably going to be stuck with the Soncino edition. Let's see here. So we're going to start off with Balaam again. He then went and raised Balaam by incantation. So that's on kilos. He raised him by incantations. He asked him, who's in great repute in the other world? Okay, so we're going to move ahead here. He then asked, what is your punishment? Balaam replied, boiling hot semen. Okay, so we're in agreement so far. Everything's the same. Onkelos raises Balaam. Balaam says, the Jews are in good repute in the underworld. What's your punishment? I'm boiling away in hot semen. Okay, he, that's Onkelos, then went and raised by incantation the sinners of Israel. Okay, this is the disagreement that we've got with the other edition, with the steinsaltz-Davidson edition. And probably the issue that Jan Irving and whoever was helping him was having is that you see the sinners of Israel and you see Balaam, and you're thinking, well, this is supposed to be Jesus, and all I see is one guy named Balaam and then another corporate entity called the sinners of Israel. Okay, so he asked the sinners of Israel, who's in repute? They replied, Israel. What about joining them? They replied, seek their welfare, not their harm. Whoever touches them touches the apple of his own eye. He said, what is your punishment? They replied, with boiling hot excrement, since a master has said, whoever mocks the words of the sages is punished with boiling hot excrement. So it's exactly the same as the other one in all the important parts, except that Jesus has been substituted with this corporate entity called the sinners of Israel. Now, helpfully, we have a footnote. The first time sinners of Israel comes up in this part, footnote 3. We're going to click on it. Footnote 3 reads, ms.m.Jesus. That means manuscript M reads Jesus here and not sinners of Israel. What's a manuscript M? Manuscript M is the Munich Codex Hebraicus 95, which is one of the most important bodies of text for the Babylonian Talmud currently in existence. It's got a long history that you can read about, and I will link the the article where I'm getting this from so that you can read it for yourself. But it says that the manuscript most likely dates from 1342 in France. So we're talking about a version of the Babylonian Talmud that's almost 700 years old by this point. It's the most complete early version of the Talmud that exists. And wouldn't you know, instead of it reading that the sinners of Israel are being talked about, it says Jesus. So what happened historically is that in Europe in this early modern period, sometime around 1300, maybe 1250 or so, Jews would convert from Christianity. They would convert from Judaism to Christianity, and then they would go tell the people in the Christian church, the clerics and the authority figures, what was in the Talmud. and they would tell him that the Talmud said that Jesus was boiling in hot excrement because he mocked the words of the sages. And then the church would put rabbis on trial, put the Talmud on trial, and the rabbis would have to defend the Talmud. And how do you defend something like this, where in the manuscript itself it says Jesus is the one who's burning in hot excrement? Well, they would say, well, we're not talking about your Jesus. We're talking about another Jesus who mocked the words of the sages. Even though if you read the New Testament, it's perfectly obvious that that's what Jesus was doing when he talks about the traditions of men versus the law of Moses. So it was ridiculous to say it then, and it's ridiculous to say it now, even though people have been saying this, also for 600-700 years. That argument has never fallen out of fashion. So what you just saw there, I recorded about 2 weeks ago, and then after this factual material and going through these translations in detail, then I gave some interpretation, and I wasn't really satisfied with it. And I got some good feedback from mr.cantstoptherobot again. And so now I'm going to give you, after a couple of weeks, my thoughts about that. So there's this is not necessarily a rebuttal, but definitely a criticism of Jan Irving and his collaborator and the ideas that Jan Irving was presenting on that show he did with Jessie Smalls, or whatever the guy's name was, I can't remember. If you're doing a critique or a criticism, there's basically two ways you can do it, at least that I can think of right now. The two ways are, one, you go through everything they said line by line, and you subject it to your own faculty of reason, and you see what you come up with. And I'm going to say that we've already done enough of that with this video, the stuff you've already seen, and then the previous one, in which I took two of these passages from the Talmud that are used by critics of the Talmud to allege ill or malevolent intent in the book and its followers. And those were, can non-Jews study the Talmud? No, the text said that they were liable to the death penalty if they do that. And second, is Jesus, according to the Talmud, burning in hell in excrement? Yes. The modern translation, the older translation, and the historical book all had this. So I think on the basis of doing this factual stuff piece by piece, the case is closed on that. As far as the rest of the quotes used by critics of the Talmud to critique it, what Irving would say is that you're going to find preponderance of those quotes are exaggerated, blown out of proportion, or just plain made up. And I would say that no, most of those quotes are correct. Most of what has been alleged is true, and that you may find some that are exaggerated, blown out of proportion, or fabricated, but the preponderance will be accurate. And I've read enough of the Talmud myself to know that that's the case. He's apparently read a lot of it by this point, and he still thinks it's not the case, but that's where we disagree. Okay, so that's the factual matters. The other thing we can do is we can look at the perspective that Jan Irving and his collaborator are coming from when they read this material. And it is my belief, from hearing certain comments from him, that he doesn't well enough understand the historical material to form accurate opinions about the book, basically. And the one that is most prominent in my mind, the most prominent evidence of this, is the distinction that Jan Irving wants to draw between Talmudic Judaism and Kabbalistic Judaism. Now, if you've listened to enough rabbis and read enough commentary and scholarship of Judaism, like I have, and I presume that Irving has not, then you will find that after Kabbalah, after the Kabbalistic tradition had really and truly emerged in Jewish life, it kind of starts maybe around 1150 or 1250, but by about 1500, the Kabbalistic Judaism is going full force. And I'll use one example. The Vilna Gaon, who was a Lithuanian rabbi and Lithuanian Talmud scholar, who I think most people, most educated persons on this issue would agree with me to say that the Vilna Gaon was the most important, most prominent Talmud scholar of the last 200 years. The most influential, the most widely reputable. He was the most important scholar of the last 200 years in study of the Talmud. He was also a noted Kabbalist. The first Ashkenaz chief rabbi of Israel, Rav Kook, was a Talmud scholar par excellence and also a Kabbalist. It's not much of a surprise to find that this is the case if you read the history of Judaic thought and the history of Judaism. I would advise people interested in this issue to go read Maimonides and go read some studies of Maimonides' work, Guide to the Perplexed. The way in which Kabbalah supersedes Talmudic study is analogous to the way that Talmudic study superseded the authority of the Torah or the Pentateuch or what Christians would call the Old Testament. Kabbalah specifically is referred to by its followers and aficionados as a higher form of interpretation, a deeper form of interpretation. They use their Kabbalistic theories to interpret the Old Testament and to give glosses to what you find in the Talmud. And his commentator, Jan Irving's commentator, or his interlocutor in that interview that I listened to, the Jessie, that guy, he specifically said that the Talmudic understanding, has 4 levels, and the Kabbalah works in exactly the same way. So this is a very well-established tradition within Judaism. So you cannot separate Talmudic Judaism from Kabbalistic Judaism in practice. It's possible that theoretically you could distinguish between the two, but it doesn't exist in the real world. It does not exist. All of these Talmudists are Kabbalists as well. And it's basically impossible to separate again. It's like once you put the cocoa powder in the milk, you get chocolate milk. You can't take the cocoa powder out again. You're finished. It's just that way forever. And what I mean by that analogy is that once the Kabbalism emerges and starts propagating itself, strongly in the 15 and 1600s, the Kabbalistic interpretations of the Talmudic texts become the standard ones, and they get passed on in all the rabbinic schools, and it just carries forward like that forever. So even if there was a pre-Kabbalistic Talmudic interpretation, that's basically gone from Jewish culture now. You might find someone out there who's trying to do that, but I think you'd be pretty hard-pressed to do so. And so the difficulty that Jan Irving and his interpretation is going to run into is that if he goes into the biographies of all of the rabbis who've been most influential since the year 1500 onward, he's going to find Kabbalism everywhere. And then he's going to be really stuck in saying there's no difference between these two traditions, and if he thinks Kabbalistic is Satanist or devil-inspired or evil or something like that, then he's going to find that the same people who use the Talmud as the central text of their religious tradition, find no contradiction between the Talmud and the Kabbalah. They work together. And in fact, there are several instances in the Talmud of Kabbalistic, or what we would think of and what the rabbis would think of as Kabbalistic magic being performed. The Talmud has recipes for amulets and charms. There's various rabbis who are affiliated with the Chabad movement and the Hasidic movement. The guy who started all of that was, like a semi-illiterate, non-Talmudically trained amulet maker. These are people who are using the name of God. Baal Shem is one of the terms that they use to describe it. The guy who started the Hasidic tradition, I think, is the Baal Shem Tov. So this is an illiterate guy who doesn't know a lot about the Talmud itself, but he's a Kabbalist, and he's using this kind of magic to do, like he's basically like a hedge magician or something for his community. So that's where that tradition begins. It's more Kabbalistic than Talmudic, but by the time, like today, 2019, you have a synthesis between the Talmudic scholarship and the Chabad Hasidic tradition. So it all just flows back into the same stream. What I'm trying to say is that even if the river has tributaries, they all come back together. They're totally compatible. So I don't really see anything that's to be gained by looking to undermine some of these difficult passages in the Talmud that people have been pointing out for the last 600 or 700 years in order to try to create a modern, or try to salvage some kind of modern Judaism that isn't contaminated with that kind of material. It's a curious project to me. I don't get it. I don't think I have any more comments on that now, other than I'm gonna publish this, whereas my last one I left unlisted because I wasn't really satisfied with it. And if anybody has any comments, I'm probably not gonna watch Irving and his friends, delving into these different quotes in the Talmud. But if any of you have seen any of those and any of them are interesting to you, you maybe let me know and I'll look at them. Thank you for your time.